Hi, everyone. It's Valerie Preston. And for those of you who, like me, discovered that when you were trying to sign on to the webinar, you had to reinstall Zoom and do many other things, I apologize for the short delay. We were using an example to see how long that process took. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a webinar today entitled The Ups and Downs of Immigration Status. Jill Hanley is from the McGill University, who is a member of the Building Migrant Resilience, Immigration et Résilience en Milieu Urbain Partnership, is going to talk about an analysis she has done with Rupaline Bhuyan and other collaborators concerning the transitions that precarious status migrants make in Canada. This is an increasingly important topic, as most of you know, as more and more people are falling out of status with the growing numbers of temporary residents in Canada. And it is one that in Canada we know relatively little about. So the way we're going to run this webinar, we are recording it, and it will be edited and posted to the BMRC-IRMU website. The second thing I need to tell you is that if you have any questions, and we really hope you have lots of questions, that you should put them in the chat, and we will look at them, or in the Q&A. And your host is actually Emily Baldassara, who knows much more about how to make this webinar work than I do. And I'm going to turn it over to her now. So thank you for coming. And Jill, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Valerie and Emily. I'm glad to be here today. I can see among the participants, there's some colleagues who know a lot about this topic probably, and others who are, there's researchers, there's people from settlement organizations. So I'm going to be sharing with you the work of one of the BMRC sub-teams. So I'll just get the PowerPoint up. And basically, we decided to focus within the partnership on this issue of transitions in immigration status. So as Valerie mentioned in the intro, this is really an important issue. We currently have more than 2 million people living in Canada with precarious immigration status, which, as you probably are familiar, this means that people are in Canada, they have basically the immigration system has designated how long they're able to be here and what they're allowed to do while they're here, but they don't have permanency, they don't have security of status. And it leads to a lot of hustle. A lot of the people that come on precarious or temporary resident statuses, their objective is ultimately to be able to stay in Canada permanently. And so being able to transition out of a temporary status into a permanent one is very important. At the same time, we know that a lot of people with temporary status transition down into being undocumented or in a more difficult status than they were to begin with. And basically what we wanted to do is understand what are the mechanisms that lead people to either access permanent status, or what leads to them falling out of status. What we're going to talk about today, I'm going to introduce my team members because they're great colleagues, and you might want to check out some of their work independently of this one. But I'm also going to make a pitch for why do secondary data analysis. This project was secondary data analysis. We had planned that even before COVID hit, but when COVID hit, it was especially interesting to be doing secondary data analysis. And then I'm going to share with you what we found in terms of documenting how people fall out of status and how people access permanent status. And I'll explain what the interest was of bringing our projects together. And finally, to talk about the implications for policy, practice, and research. And again, I want to emphasize that probably a lot of what I'm going to say today will sound familiar to the participants in this webinar. I know you guys have a lot of experience with immigration, but in the literature in Canada, it's really not well documented what these mechanisms are, or they're documented by group. And our project is aiming to sort of give this systemic portrait of what's happening in terms of making people fall out of status, in which case they become vulnerable and even more precarious, or what helps them gain access to permanent. So just to start, we had participants from team members from 4 universities, and we were drawing on research projects that were done by 5 of us. So Rupali Bhuyan contributed data from a study on caregivers, migrant caregivers. I contributed data from a study on different categories of immigrants and people with precarious status in temp agency work, so focused on labor. Delphine Nakash had a project on how temporary foreign workers transition into permanent residency. And Sonia Ben Sultan contributed data from her research on North African women migrants and their sort of transitions through immigration processes. And finally, Lindsay Larios had data related to precarious status migrants who were pregnant and their reproductive rights. On top of that, Heather Bergen, Kathy Schmidt, and Ola Hajar were doctoral research assistants, and we worked really collectively on all of this to pull it together. So the first pitch that I'm going to make is, why do secondary data analysis? And when we say this, we're basically meaning we're taking data that has already been collected for another purpose, and we're analyzing it with a new research question. So I want to ask you if you guys can put in the chat reasons why it's interesting to do secondary data analysis. Do people want to chime in? You can put it in the chat. Just some ideas you might have about why we might want to do this. It's not the same as being in person where I could stare right at you and encourage you to say something. If people are taking a minute to warm up, it's okay. I'll go to the next slide. But basically, I think a lot of researchers these days, we're in a situation where we're sort of constantly in a cycle of needing to like get the next project going. We're constantly collecting data, and it's rare that I think we like make full use of the data that we've collected. So when you do secondary data analysis, like there's a very practical side of it, that it saves time and resources, that it's very expensive to collect data. And if we have existing data that might help us answer the question, we can save the time and money that it would take to collect new data. And I also think there's some ethical responsibility to make full use of the data that we do collect. When we do our research projects, we're often asking for collaboration from community organizations. Some of you on this webinar today may be partners from community groups that are being asked all the time to participate. And if you have contributed to a research project, I think it's important that we feel that people's contributions are used to their full value. So to not kind of waste people's efforts and time, and people who did interviews, that their time is not wasted, and that we take full advantage of their contributions. But there's also just the demands on partners. I know when we're studying precarious migrants in particular, it's very hard to reach this population without going through community organizations that already have relationships with them. So we end up often, those of us who study this field, we often go back to the same organizations, a small number of them, over and over. For me, it's been 20 years, some of these groups that I'm going to, and it's demanding of them, and they don't have probably all the resources they would like to have to do their core mission. And even if we make contributions to recognize their contributions to a research project, it's still taking their time. And so if we can answer some of our research questions without asking them to be involved again, there's a benefit to that. And then also hard to reach populations, we often hear organizations or people themselves saying they're kind of sick of being asked to do interviews and answer questions. So again, if we can avoid that, let's do it. But there are disadvantages. And the first one is that if you collect data for one purpose, it might not fully answer your research question. So I'll give the example from my own study that was looking at the relationship between having precarious immigration status and temporary placement agency work. So we talked about status, but we didn't get into all the nitty-gritty details of exactly how people's immigration trajectory played out. We were really just looking for the connection between status and work, so that for this new analysis we were doing, where we were trying to understand transitions in status, sometimes we might have information that someone transitioned in status, but not have all the details of what exactly happened. So you can have less satisfying answers to your questions. And also you are asking a question that takes it outside of the context of the study. So if you're doing it a few years later and you're looking at interviews, you might not remember what was happening socially at the time that those interviews were collected. Or you might be looking at someone else's interviews and not understand that all these participants come from one community organization or something like that. So you might also lose some of the contextual knowledge, and including the relationship of the researcher to the data collection itself. So when you're looking at your own data, you know what your relationship is to those people, how you met them, that kind of thing. It's not always clear if you're reading someone else's. And there's ethical concerns. Typically you can't really use someone's data if you haven't asked them in advance if you can use it for something else. And there's the concern that if someone agreed to do an interview about one topic, is it ethical to take their story and use it for a different type of question? So I think that's something to be really conscious of, that we don't want to betray people's trust. And also generally our universities will have some pretty stringent requirements around ethics and secondary data analysis. There's increasing push in the field of research to share our data. With quantitative data, it's fairly feasible to make sure that quantitative data that the participants can't be identified. And increasingly, we're encouraged to share quantitative databases. For qualitative research, it's newer that people are talking about sharing this data, because typically qualitative data, it's much easier to identify the participants, and it's more intimate information often that people share. And so there's concerns about sharing that outside of the immediate research team. If I think of myself, even I often have information in interviews related to undocumented migrants, for example, that I choose not to publish because I feel like it's not safe, that there might be dynamics or strategies people are using that I don't want to publish. And if I made the interviews available openly, then I don't know how other people would use it. So I wouldn't share that information without seriously editing my interviews. So those are some ideas. So why did we do this project? So I'm here. This is a repeat of what I said at the beginning. These are the focuses of the original projects that we were drawing our data from. And what brought us together is that all of us were clear that in our studies, even though they were on different topics, this problem of the difficulty of transitioning to positive status and the how easy it is to fall out of status came through for all these different categories of workers. And there was rich information about immigration status. So we wanted to take advantage of that and read it. I'm seeing there were some comments in the chat about reasons to do secondary data analysis. Thank you. I didn't see it at the time we were talking. So yes, it allows us also to compare between different studies, and that is really useful. So that's basically what we wanted to do here. We wanted to see whether the mechanisms that led to people falling out of status or that help people get into better status were similar across different categories of precarious migrants. So all of us researchers that are on this team, we were like frustrated because we felt like, you know, some of us been 20 years we were doing research where we're really talking about the problem with precarious status. And you know, people were feeling like, you know, I've documented it for caregivers, I've documented it for agricultural workers, I've documented it for refugee claimants. Like, what else do we have to say here to document the problem with precarious status? And also concerned about going back to the same partners again to talk to them about immigration issues. And finally, there was this interest in like sharing and comparing our results. Prior to this project, most of us had not worked together before. We were aware of each other's work, but we didn't have collaborations. So our objective was to look across these different studies and see if we could identify what are the tipping points, like I've said. So what makes people fall out of status, what's helped them get better status. And this is like really critical because those of you that are working in settlement agencies, you probably spend a huge proportion of your time trying to help people with these questions. And when people are having problems, when they fall out of status, it is a huge amount of work to help them regularize their status again. And for them, it's very difficult for their sense of well-being and their access to all their social rights. It's really a very difficult situation to be in. And the effort we make to try and help people access permanent residency is also huge. So if we can understand better what are these tipping points and what are the patterns across, it's not like it's a random thing. We think there's some systemic elements of this, but it's not been empirically documented very often. So the idea was to come up with information that was going to be helpful for policy, but especially for practice, both in terms of casework and organizing. So why is it important to understand these things? Well, actually, I guess I just said it. So I'm wondering if people have ideas about what are the tipping points that make people fall out of status. So here we're thinking about, mostly we're talking about people that are here, that they have precarious status. And just to remind people, we're talking about more than 2 million people in Canada right now who are present. Latest stats I've seen was 2.2 million people in Canada with precarious status, all of whom are at risk of becoming undocumented. So if you have ideas, like examples of things that make someone go from having, for example, a work permit to becoming undocumented, someone who's a refugee claimant who becomes undocumented, what's some of the things that happen to people? So McGill is, putting lots of things in one. So if you're working and you lose your job and your presence in Canada relied on having that job, you can lose your status. But there's also people that it wasn't their, they're not here as migrant workers, but because they lost their employment, they were unable to pay the fees to renew their student visa, for example, or they couldn't get some medical exam that was required for a different status. These things can be a problem. Loss of sponsorship by a family member. You're in a conjugal relationship and your partner is promising to sponsor you and the relationship goes bad, or even to the point it becomes abusive and your sponsorship gets dropped. Health problems. Yes, you become ill and you don't stay on top of all this administrative stuff you have to do to keep your status in play. Yeah, I see Genevieve is pointing out sometimes people don't have the language proficiency that's required to like access a better status. You're putting the example in Quebec. It's also an issue in the rest of Canada, but the standard is a little bit lower outside of Quebec. Yeah, missing deadlines. Also just knowing when the deadlines are. If you're like busy working and studying and looking after your kids and everything, you might not stay right on top of all the administrative stuff you have to do. So there's many things like this. So these are these are the types of things that we documented across all of these statuses. So we have, migrant workers, we have students, we have refugee claimants, we have people who are undocumented already. We have people waiting for family sponsorship. So employment problems come up over and over again, whether it's just like economic problems that they lose their job for economic reasons, but going all the way up to exploitation, where the employer is actively sort of blocking the person from renewing their status or getting a more permanent status. There's family problems like were raised, whether it's related to sponsorship or not. Sometimes just family crisis leads people to miss deadlines or lack money to renew their status, or the person who needs to sign is not able to do so at that moment. Same idea with health problems, that they can just interfere with people's capacity to follow through on all the requirements that are expected for their precarious status, and unable to maintain it, so they lose their status. But the thing that we have really spent a lot of time documenting, and I'm going to share later that we have a recently published article on this, is this idea of bureaucratic violence. We were actually pretty shocked across all of the studies to what degree errors and lack of communication or discretionary decisions taken by IRCC or the MIFI in Quebec played into people falling out of status. So where clear errors in interpretation of the regulations for immigration, and a person being denied a renewal of their status or denied a certain type of status, that when we looked at these decisions, we have a lawyer on the team, we have other people with like lots of experience doing immigration casework. It was clearly errors. It was very common. And in the last little while, there's also been a lot of examples of like documents being lost and this type of thing. But what was clear was that any type of problem on the administrative side by IRCC or MIFI, the consequence still fell on the migrant, and it's very difficult for people to recover from those types of problems. So very rarely did we see IRCC or MIFI taking responsibility for these types of errors, and the person would just be left to have to start over again. And sometimes that wasn't even possible because of the falling undocumented and seemingly like violating their conditions. So one of the big contributions of this project, we feel, is having really documented very carefully across a big range of statuses to what degree administrative error and discretionary decision-making in IRCC is harming people that have precarious status. We can have a chat later about, I'm sure you have examples of this, but this idea that there's little recourse if there is this type of error or just delays and sometimes it's not errors, but just the delays are so long that the people end up in very vulnerable situations while they're waiting. So we have published an article on this idea of bureaucratic violence, and we want to go forward with that in terms of having more technical information about where the problems are happening in the immigration system right now. So that's falling out of status. So this is happening all the time. We also saw that people come in and out of these statuses. So that's why we call the presentation ups and downs. It's because we often imagine that once someone becomes, gets a status, that it's an upward trend. Well, we see that people get status, they lose status, they get a new one. It's like up and down over time. So it's a lot of stress for people. I'll just have a look in that question and answer thing. Okay, people put information about why do secondary data analysis there. Thank you. So what about ideas for what helps people secure better status? Because we also know that there's like critical moments that happen that suddenly someone has some options, or they have opportunities to secure their status. Can people give some ideas of like what those tipping points might be for improvement? Okay, I will go ahead, but feel free to chime in again. So again, across all these different statuses, we do see some of the things, I see the things that people are putting in here now. So marrying someone who can sponsor you, so family support, conjugal support, yes, makes all the difference. So if you're in a good relationship, this is fantastic. It can lead to you getting a permanent status. I didn't include education success, but it sort of fits with this employment success. So people who have come as international students or come as migrant workers and are in categories that can access permanent residency through the Canadian Experience class or the Quebec Experience program, if they sort of manage to like do what they're supposed to do, graduate from their program, work for 2 years consistently, if that's all going well, then it is relatively possible. It's quite sure if everything goes well on that trajectory that you will be able to access permanent residency. But we also see that the rules change a lot when people are in the middle of their program. So for example, when they switch to being able to apply for permanent residency for international students directly after graduating versus today, they have to work for 1 or 2 years after graduating in order to access permanent residency. So the kind of milestones can change on you when you're in the middle of it. Good advice. So yeah, accessing community resources or legal services that guide people well. We didn't put on the other side, we also saw a lot of like bad legal advice to people about how to handle things that on the flip side, if they find the organization or the kind of gatekeeper person who can give them good advice and accompaniment, that makes all the difference. And then on the other side of sort of the discretionary decisions that are harmful to people, we also saw examples of immigration agents making sort of benevolent decisions, making helpful decisions that bent the rules a bit, but allowed someone to get status when it seemed the right thing to do. So, with all of these tipping points, we were really trying to try and articulate them across the statuses to look at what were the systemic elements of what's happening. And what comes out strongly in our research is that it really is a systemic issue, that we have a very complex immigration system at this point, many different precarious statuses, and it's supposed to be sort of according to rules. The trajectory for people to go from these temporary statuses into more permanent ones. Well, first of all, we see that there's discrimination among these statuses about which people are considered sort of desirable as permanent residents in Canada or not. So some people, for example, farm workers, are just completely cut out of any kind of direct trajectory towards permanent residency. We see other people that have very long processes. For example, refugee claimants right now, that it's taking years for them to get decisions, and a lot of administrative problems in the meantime with things like work permits, health care, all that kind of stuff. But even those that are considered desirable by the Canadian state, for example, international students who've graduated, they've made it more complicated to get access, and more people are having trouble with this trajectory, including, for example, admitting many more temporary residents than there are quotas for their transition to permanent residency. So even if there is a clear pathway, there's a bottleneck, and many of the people that are on this temporary status will never be able to access permanent residency, only because we've put a quota that's much lower than the number of people we're bringing in. So all of this leads to difficulties for people, and we were hoping that the project would help contribute to the conversation about what to do about this. We've been talking for a long time about the problem with precarious status. In most of Canada, except for Quebec, settlement agencies still are not even funded to serve these 2.2 million people who have major settlement challenges. So I wanted to open it up at this point to some discussion about what to do about this. We have good documentation of what we call bureaucratic violence. We'll find another way to talk about it when we're talking to IRCC, but to me, one starting point is really to like focus on that accountability side of things from the immigration department. I think it's kind of reached a horrible state at this point. And I'm wondering what else people would like to suggest. There has been like one change at the federal level is the ESDC funding to serve migrant workers that's come about since COVID, since 2020. This is a positive thing, but I think it's still really far below what it would mean to actually fund settlement agencies to serve migrant workers and other categories of precarious status workers, precarious status migrants. I hear this over and over from settlement workers in other parts of Canada that, most of the time people will not turn away a precarious status person. They will at least try and refer them, give them some information, but they don't have the resources to give the full level of services that they'd like to. Valerie's asking what I mean by accountability. So what I mean by this is that the immigration system right now is there's no way to easily challenge a mistake that's made with an immigration file. So for example, it's very hard for people if they like a classic thing would be you submit your application to renew your work permit, and you get back a refusal that says it's refused because you didn't provide a copy of your passport. And you look at what was uploaded, you can clearly see the passport is there. You're like, what? But you can't just call immigration and say, hey, I think there was a mistake made. If you look at my file, my passport is there. That's not a reason to refuse my thing. You cannot contact them. It's almost impossible to get a person on the phone, and doing it through the system, very difficult. I've also had multiple examples where people where the online system was just not working for them. There was some glitch in the program and they lost their status because this persisted over weeks and they missed the deadline for their renewal. And when I say accountability, it's that when things like this happen that are it's coming from the actions of IRCC or their technology or whatever, but the person who applied is left with zero and has to start over, as opposed to there being some kind of mechanism where you could talk to a person, or you could, without going to court about it, that you could try and discuss the problem and solve it. Because some of these are small issues. On bigger levels where there's more like, of course, different agents have different biases and things like this. So there's been cases around the human trafficking temporary resident permit where certain agents were just refusing everybody. We've also had that with open work permit applications, like specific agents who were refusing like 90% of the applications. And there was no way to get any kind of explanation or question that without, we ended up going through politicians. So I'm starting to see some stuff in the chat here. This is great. So I'm reading what Catherine has written. So some of my recent focus on, oh yeah, so you're talking about this quota issue. And yes, I think this is a huge issue because people, the clearest one is with international students, that there's no limit on the number of international students that come in. And people are coming with the information that completing the right type of degree and doing work afterwards, you're going to be able to access permanent residency. But with the quotas that are so much lower than the number of people coming in, people are running out of time because you can't renew your postgraduate work permit indefinitely. So if you're into your third year after graduating and you still haven't made it through the, or it's no room in the quotas for your application, you can become undocumented. So this is really unjust, and also like doesn't make sense for Canada. So this is a problem. Fall into non-status, vulnerable to exploitation. So that would be very interesting to talk with you more about that, Catherine. And then Marie-Jeanne is talking about the delays in processing. So, and the limit of age for permanent residency, that can happen at the low end when, if your application is in before a child hits 18 or 22, depending on what they're doing, you're usually okay if the application was submitted before, but at the top end, also people who are passing age 40, 45, it gets more and more difficult. So this is a problem. And this issue of delays, it can be really shocking, like years or like a year to get a work permit renewal for someone. And that means that in all of that time, they can have trouble getting hired. Their social insurance number is going to be shown as expired while they're waiting for the renewal, even though they're supposed to have the sort of implied right to work during that time. Many employers don't trust it. In Quebec, we have the problem that their health insurance is going to expire when the first work permit is over, and they won't be able to get a new health card until the new work permit is emitted. So that can be months and months with no health coverage. This is a great big problem. And I think there's something to be asked here about, Canada is sort of identifying that it's in our interest to have higher numbers of migrants, temporary and permanent, but there needs to be investment in the immigration system so that the files can be treated in a reasonable delay. So we have a question about what happens when people become undocumented. So somebody who is undocumented is at risk of detention and deportation. So basically, if they encounter law enforcement or immigration officials who realize that they are without status, they can be immediately detained, and deportation can happen within a matter of days sometimes. So it's a real risk for people. If they are sort of between statuses and they have an application being studied by immigration, especially if they put in that application before their last status expired, they usually have what's called implied status. So they're sort of tolerated, but they don't have full access to their rights in that period of time. And people are living very long times like that right now. Do any other countries have systems that enable bureaucratic accountability? I have to say that I am not sure. And it would be interesting to look at, but I don't know. Felicitas. But is that happening? Do you mean, are people being deported? Yes, people are, if you mean that, if you're asking if people are being deported, yes, people are being deported. Yeah, yes, it's happening. In our own this data that we looked at, there were a number of people in the interviews that were deported, and in the course of a longitudinal study, the researchers were continuing to speak with them after they had been deported. So we had information about people that had experienced that. Yeah. Yeah. So do we have a bias towards people that have had bad experiences in immigration? And I would say yes. I'm sure we do, because we're going through organizations that help people that have problems. So we do have that bias, and I feel like I often need to remind myself when I'm talking that, like, okay, not everybody has these terrible experiences, but my feeling about it is that there are enough people that do, that it's unacceptable. So for example, a lot of my work focuses on migrant workers, and I'll often say, like, of course, there are good employers that treat their workers well and respect the labor standards and all of these types of things. But we have a system that makes it that if things go wrong, the migrants are in a very bad position. So we've created a system that has these pitfalls for people, and we could fix that. So I think it's like, while completely recognizing that sometimes it goes smoothly for people, there's enough people that it doesn't go smoothly for, that we need to look at the mechanisms and try and fix that system. But yes, I'm sure that we have over representation of people with hard times. Yeah. Other questions or comments people would like to make? So I guess we kind of talked about this. We're still working on it. It's not like I claim to have the answers to this, or our team claims to have the answer to this, but we in our analysis on bureaucratic violence, we are trying to push our reflection on, like, technically speaking, what would it take to overcome some of these problems? And there are some issues just in terms of, like, the resources to process applications so that documents aren't overlooked, that if something gets refused for a minor error, that there's some way to just fix it, the way there often is in other bureaucracies, where sort of lack of access to live agents is also something that's really causing a lot of difficulties here, because things that could be cleared up verbally, it's impossible to do that with a website. And I mean, people have just been pointing out for years how the provisions of many temporary statuses just put people into situations of vulnerability. So when you're dependent on an employer, you're dependent on a place in a university that costs exorbitant amounts of money. These things just put you in a situation where you're going to have difficulty, or where if you have difficulty, you have more problems. So just took us out of our thing here. So I wanted to share with you guys our upcoming publications. So this one about bureaucratic violence is already published, and it'll go through a lot of the more technical points that I was referring to. There's another one that is coming out very shortly in the International Journal of Migration and Border Studies. That's really, it's more theoretical, but sort of theorizing, conceptualizing the way that state immigration policies are shaping people's life experiences. And we're working on an article now. It's not quite finished, and there may be new authors added to it from the team also, but on the process of doing qualitative secondary data analysis. So as a way to like make better use of the data we have and take some weight off of our partners and participants. So that's where I'm at. So do people want to make any comments or questions? Oh, the question about what do I think about the use of AI? I feel like I need to wrap my head around that because it's coming from all directions. I don't know a lot about the pros and cons of using AI in a situation like immigration. One thing that I would worry about is that from what I hear, AI tends to sort of reproduce some of the biases that are present already, and people applying for immigration status are like disproportionately members of groups that face discrimination and bias in our society. So would it work? I'm not sure. It probably will be put to work though, I'm guessing. Petra Molnar about AI, she's working on AI. Okay, that's interesting. So anonymous attendee, you can look at what Petra Molnar is doing, but yeah. So I feel like there's a lot of interesting people among watching this that I cannot see or interact with. So I hope that we get a chance to see each other another time and talk about this in person. Maybe there'll be some seminar sometime. Yeah. Any last comments or anything? Okay.
So Jill, let me just ask the audience one more time. Any more questions? Oh, write the name. Oh,
It's there. It's
yeah, Michaela just wrote it into the chat, Felicitas. No more questions or comments? I'm going to give you 3. I want to thank you all for attending, but most of all, I want to thank Jill, who has given us a very provocative presentation. This is a huge issue, and it is only going to become a growing issue. And I'm also think that I have a whole lot of questions about how you actually use other people's qualitative data. I think that raises a bunch of issues for all of us. So I want to thank you, Jill. The PowerPoint that you've seen today, we will put it up on the BMRC website, and we will be putting this video up. And Jill, is there any last word you would like to say?
Well, just thank you to everyone for coming, and I think there's people here I'm sure we'll continue to have exchanges with about this. So thank you.